Good morning, Barry Bryson here. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. And we're continuing our study of the parables in Matthew's Gospel. And we're in Matthew chapter 7 today. And we're going to talk about the parable of the wise and foolish builders. And this is the first full parable in Matthew's Gospel. Herbert Lockyer, in his book that I mentioned a few days ago, All the Parables of the Bible, he finds 10 other parables in Matthew's Gospel. But what he's talking about are metaphors and similes. He's not talking about straight up parable the way this is. This is the first. And like the first psalm that we just studied a few weeks ago, it is the one that takes us to school, that teaches us to read a parable. And so let's pay attention to it. It's a story that we know. It's the wise and foolish builders. We've sung the song. The song, The Wise Man Built His House on a Rock, is more than 120 years old. That's how long we've been singing that song. And it's based upon this story that is so indelible that everybody knows it and will never forget it. Jesus says, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended and the floods came and the winds blew and burst against that house. Yet it did not fall, for it had been founded upon the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house upon the sand. And the rain descended and the floods came and the winds blew and burst against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall." The result was that when Jesus had finished these words, the multitudes were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority, not as one of their scribes. Now, their scribes and teachers did preach using parables to communicate um, to the masses. They just did. And Jesus did too. Jesus is the only person in the New Testament who tells parables. But Jesus is standing firmly in a tradition that reaches back into the Old Testament and that was being practiced prominently in his own day. Um, Jesus, prior to these verses, which is where the therefore comes, says, "Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father." You can't just say it, you have to do it. So he tells us this story of a wise man and a foolish man. And they're both building a house. One builds a house on the rock and one builds his house on the sand. The rains come on both houses. The floods come on both houses. One falls, one does not. What is the difference? And it teaches us to read these stories and to look for the comparisons and the contrasts. What is constant and what is variable? So what is constant in this story? The hearing. Everyone who hears and does do, everyone who hears and does not do. The hearing. The truth about God is evident. Paul's going to make this point in Romans chapters 1 and 2, so that no one who is alive has an excuse. The hearing is constant. God's truth is out there, and we're all responsible for that truth. What else is constant? The storms and the floods are constant. Doing the right thing, the wrong thing doesn't change the fact that living life in a sinful world is going to present its own challenges and present them on a daily basis, whether we pursue a course of goodness or a course of evil. Evil, of course, has its own um, repercussions, it has its own consequences, but everyone, often the evil consequences of others have a bearing on the lives of those who have not committed those crimes or those sins. We know that. That's going to happen. What else is constant? The building is constant. We are all putting a life together. We are all building something day by day, minute by minute, hour by hour, brick by brick. We're putting together a life. And that life is either going to stand the test or it's not going to stand the test. So all those things are the variable are constant. There is one variable and only one variable in this story, and it is the doing. And therein lies the lesson. He who hears these words of mine and does them, he who hears these words of mine and does not do them. What's the difference? The difference is in the doing. Building your house on the rock is being obedient to the things that Jesus has said. And so he is asserting his authority in this parable. Listen to what I say and do it, or there will be consequences. And the people understood that. That's why they were amazed at his teaching. He was teaching them as one having authority, not as one of their scribes. Okay, so it's one of the most effective of all the parables. It is so straightforward. It teaches us to read a parable. It is almost without our knowing it, training us to think a certain way when we come to a parable. And it really encapsulates the message of all the parables. We have to listen to God and do what he says. Okay. We're going to turn next time to chapter 9. There's only one other parable. There's a couple of parables that are a pair together. They're pendant together. Before we get to Matthew 13, we'll look at Matthew 9 next time. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word.